From about 605 to 535 BC, God's chosen nation of Israel went through the Babylonian exile, described in our first reading today. And the psalm is a lament, a song expressing the sorrow these Jews felt when it seemed like God had abandoned them. Why, though? Why did God allow the Babylonians, this pagan empire, to conquer Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and exile his chosen people to a foreign land? Sin, obviously. God promises never to abandon his people, yet he also promises to punish them if they break the covenant. And that's exactly what they did. Israel sinned, added infidelity to infidelity. But which sins? What specific choices prompted God to allow his own house to be destroyed? All sin is bad, but we see three things mentioned: the abominations of the nations, polluting the Lord's temple, and not honoring the Sabbath. Yes, not resting on the Sabbath really is one of the reasons God himself lists for the Babylonian exile. The prophet Jeremiah says right here, until the land has retrieved its lost Sabbaths, during all the time it lies waste, it shall have rest, while 70 years are fulfilled. Almost 1,000 years before this moment, as we heard last week actually, God establishes a covenant with Israel through Moses, giving them the 10 Commandments, one of which is to rest on the Sabbath day every week. That means for 52 days out of every year, they should be resting, letting even their land and their animals rest with them. And over 1,000 years, at 52 days per year, comes out to about 140 years worth of Sabbath rest. Jeremiah just told us that the land lost 70 of those years of rest. Not that the land is literally tired. It's a metaphor for the fact that the Israelites were breaking the third commandment about half of the time. Now, maybe breaking the 10 Commandments half of the time doesn't sound that bad to you, but it's a covenant. So if we put it like this, if you caught your spouse cheating on you, would it help much for them to say, well, I only cheated half the time? Hardly. God takes this seriously. As I said last week, Jesus is not focused on nitpicky technicalities. He's clear. The Sabbath is for man, not man for the Sabbath. Necessity, reasonable adjustments, charity, lack of other options, these factors all matter in how we observe the Sabbath. But we do still need to observe it. God tore down his temple, in part because the Jews ignored this commandment. And we have Jesus. We have even less excuse than the ancient Israelites. So don't think we get a pass on this. But why? Why does God care so much about us resting on the Sabbath? Why spend 2 weekends preaching on this topic? In part because of the other two sins that are listed as the reason for the Babylonian exile: polluting the temple and the abominations of the nations. Last week we see Jesus turning over the tables because they were polluting the temple with worldly enterprises in a sacred space. And it was even worse before the exile. Time and space are connected, and if we are willing to disrespect God's time, it means we will be willing to disrespect his space. It's not an accident that people started making ugly churches around the time that people started working more on Sundays. It's not an accident that they tore beautiful things out of the churches around the same time business hours extended into more and more of the weekend. Human beings need times and places that are set apart. This is why we don't do certain things in a church. I'd imagine there'd be some outrage if I offered to use the inside of this church as a skate park during the week. Or if you saw me walking down the street with the chalice I use for Mass, sipping rum and Coke out of it. These things are set apart. Disrespect for sacred time means disrespect for sacred space, disrespect for sacred things, and ultimately disrespect of sacred people. And all of us are sacred, made in God's image. Right? The rise of adult entertainment also coincides with the same few decades that we see ugly churches and busy Sundays. The Sabbath is for us to remember who God is and who we are. And all of this ties into the worst sin, the first reason given for the exile, the abominations of the nations. Translation, idolatry, debauchery, murder. I've already mentioned the rise in lust, but do you know what else got really popular around the same time that we started disrespecting the Sabbath and uglifying our churches? Child sacrifice. Sure, some hide behind the name choice, but there are groups of people literally claiming that abortion is a sacrament in their religion in order to get it legalized or keep it legal in their state. And all of this is tied to idolatry, to putting things ahead of God. For most people, it's a subtle idolatry, hidden, worshiping ourselves, money, power, popularity. Yet now, it's not that hard to find people practicing ancestor and nature worship, witchcraft, rituals of Norse gods like Odin and Thor, and people who not only believe in aliens, but worship them. They might exist, but they're certainly not gods. And yet some think they are. In short, the Israelites are exiled because they broke the first commandment and worshiped false gods. But one of the reasons they got to the point of doing idolatry was that they were willing to break the third commandment, to keep holy the Sabbath. All of the commandments hang together, but the third is a powerful linchpin because it very directly sets us apart from the world. It allows us to experience the fact that we are set apart, made different, and without it, we inevitably end up in exile. Now, maybe we won't be literally taken to a foreign country like the ancient Israelites, but if we do not keep holy the Sabbath, we will find ourselves held hostage by a culture that not only doesn't practice our faith, but tries to prevent us from practicing. Does that sound like a familiar trend to you? A culture that goes from serving God to ignoring God to persecuting those who serve God. The Sabbath rest gives us the time and space to look at our lives in the light of God's plan. And that light is the real reason this is so important. As Jesus tells us, the light came into the world with his birth. And although he transformed the Sabbath and moved it to Sunday, he nonetheless commands us to act in memory of him. And he, the light, dies and rises from the dead. But why did he wait? Why die on Good Friday, but wait till Easter Sunday to rise? Why does he do nothing on Holy Saturday? Because it's the Sabbath, and the Sabbath is meant for rest. Do you get that? Do you feel how significant that is? The most important historical event in the universe is the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And he puts the Sabbath rest smack in the middle of it. This is an integral part of our very salvation and identity. But people preferred darkness to light because their works were evil, and everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come toward the light so that his works might not be exposed. To rest, to really set aside worldly concerns in a Sabbath rest, allows us to step into the light. It's why people fear silence, why people make themselves busier, even as they complain they're too busy. This is why rest, real rest, is actually pretty hard to do. To truly rest requires the choice to simply be in the light. This is done through worship, through prayer, through reflective engagement with truth and goodness and beauty. It's done through healthy and virtuous enjoyment of the good things given us by God. It is done through the choice to admit your limits, turn off the news, set aside the political agendas, put down your efforts to do everything yourself, and trust and rest in that trust. This is why adoration, doing nothing in God's presence, is so highly encouraged. And even if these things cannot always be done on a Sunday, though you should prioritize that, they can be built into your life each and every week, and really even daily on some level. This kind of resting is frightening because if I am too quiet and too still, if I do not distract myself or bury myself with work, I might actually have to see my own heart and mind, to reveal my intentions, expose my faults, and learn to question my integrity. We run from Sabbath rest because we hope that if we just stay busy and distracted and dissipated, we won't notice how in love we are with sin and how far we are from God. But we cannot hide forever. Either we learn to rest in the light and be transformed by it, or we will be dragged into exile.